They turned my onion farm into a racetrack while I was gone. And the worst part is, they really believed they had every right to do it. I didn't find out until I came back home and saw the ground itself had been rewritten like my property was just a blank page someone could scribble on. And by the time I realized what was happening, the damage was already done. My name is Evan Carter, and I've spent most of my life working a stretch of land we call Sweet Valley Farm down in southern Georgia. Nothing fancy, just rows and rows of sweet onions that somehow turned into a legacy after my grandfather helped certify part of this region back in the 80s. And ever since then it's been simple. You stay on your side of the boundary, and I stay on mine. That's just how people survived out here. The farm sits along Hollis County Road on the western edge, then runs deep north into land that has never been anything but agriculture. Or at least it was until a man named Dylan Mercer showed up. Dylan ran one of those motorsports promotion companies out of Savannah, the kind that turns mud and noise into weekend entertainment. And I remember the first time he drove up, his truck was half lifted, caked in clay like he had just come out of a different world entirely. He stepped out smiling like we already shared an understanding. He talked fast about mud bog competitions, truck festivals, sponsorships, and how this whole region was perfect for expansion. And I just stood there wiping dirt off my hands thinking this guy doesn't see land. He sees opportunity. I told him straight, this is a certified onion farm, not an entertainment zone, and the boundary runs clean along Hollis County Road. Nothing crosses it. Nothing bends it. He nodded like he was listening, but it wasn't the kind of nod that meant agreement. It was the kind that meant he had already rewritten things in his head. For a while, I didn't think much of it, because around here people talk big all the time. Developers, promoters, investors, they all say the same thing until reality slows them down. So I went back to work, checking soil reports, preparing for harvest season. Going to a growers meeting up in Atlanta where everyone was talking about export contracts and certification requirements like it actually mattered to the world beyond farming. I was gone maybe 10 weeks total. Nothing unusual for that time of year. Just enough time for the land to breathe before harvest. And I remember driving back down the long dirt access road feeling that quiet kind of relief you only get when you're returning to something familiar, something stable. But as I rounded the last bend towards Sweet Valley Farm, that feeling disappeared completely. At first I thought I was seeing construction runoff, just disturbed earth, maybe erosion control work gone wrong. But then I got closer and saw shapes, carved lines, deep cuts in the ground, water-filled pits reflecting the sky where onion rows used to be. And berms built like stadium seating rising out of my fields. And I just slowed the truck until it stopped, because my brain refused to connect what my eyes were showing me. There was a mud racing track sitting in the middle of my certified farmland like it had always belonged there, complete with carved lanes, parking areas, and sections that looked like they were designed for crowds, not crops. I remember sitting there with both hands on the wheel thinking this has to be temporary. This has to be some kind of mistake. But the deeper I looked, the worse it got. 12 acres at least completely reshaped, soil turned over so violently, it looked like the land had been punished. I called Dylan right there from the truck, trying to keep my voice steady, and when he picked up he sounded excited, like race day was coming up and I was just another supporter calling to check in. I told him, very clearly, that he had built a mud racing track on my onion farm and it needed to be removed immediately, filled back in, restored, all of it. He laughed a little, like I was overreacting, and said something about their championship course and permits and how the county had already approved everything. And for a second, I just sat there listening to him talk over my silence. Then I told him again, slower this time, that none of that matters because he built it on land he does not own. That's when his tone shifted, just slightly, annoyance creeping in, and he said something about their contractor knowing boundaries better than anyone, and maybe Hollis County Road had been widened. Maybe the line wasn't what I thought it was anymore. That was the first real moment I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger yet. Just this cold realization that he wasn't confused, he was committed. I hung up and sat there looking across my farm, at what used to be rows of certified onions now buried under mud pits and gravel lanes, and I remember thinking I don't even know where to start with this, because this wasn't just damage, this was a full rewrite of my life's work. And that's when I called the only person I trusted with numbers and facts, a land surveyor named Mark Ellison. The same guy who had handled our certification verification back in 2021, and I told him I needed answers fast, because something about all of this didn't add up. I didn't know it yet, but what he was about to send me would turn a bad situation into something a lot more serious, something that couldn't be talked away or laughed off. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't going to stay a misunderstanding for long. Mark didn't ask me many questions on the phone, which is how I knew he was already taking it seriously. He just said he'd pull the county records, recheck the original survey markers, and meet me at the property line as soon as he could, and that quiet confidence in his voice did more for me than anything Dylan had said all week. I stayed parked on the edge of my own farm for nearly an hour, just watching what used to be my onion rows, thinking about how quickly something permanent can be treated like it's flexible, like land is just another contract you can renegotiate after the fact. When Mark finally arrived, he didn't even look at me first. He just walked straight to the edge of Hollis County Road with his GPS equipment like he already knew what he was going to find, but needed the numbers to confirm it. The air was thick that day, heavy Georgia heat sitting on everything, and the sound of those mud track generators in the distance felt almost insulting, like the land was being used against itself. Mark set his gear down, took his time, measured, recalibrated, cross-checked old county maps. And I remember standing there watching him in silence thinking this is the part where reality either saves you or finishes you off. After a few minutes he straightened up, looked at me, then looked back at the track cutting through my field and said, "Evan, this isn't even close. They crossed the boundary by a quarter mile in some sections." I didn't say anything right away because my brain needed time to accept what that meant, not just legally, but physically, emotionally. Like I was trying to understand how something that obvious could ever happen in the first place. He showed me the overlays, old survey lines compared to what was built, and it was worse than I thought. The track didn't just touch my land. It sliced through it like someone had drawn over it with a heavy black marker and pressed down until the soil gave up. Mark offered to send a formal notice, the kind that forces acknowledgement, and I told him to do it immediately, because at that point I wasn't interested in conversations anymore. I wanted records, documentation, something that couldn't be twisted by confidence or charm. Within a day, Dylan got the notice, and I found out not from him, but from an email forwarded by Mark, because suddenly everything had lawyers attached to it. Atlanta letterheads, references to permits, environmental assessments, drainage approvals, all of it written in that polished language people use when they want to make something illegal sound complicated enough to doubt. Dylan called me after that. And this time he didn't sound excited. He sounded irritated, like I had interrupted something important. He told me again that everything was approved, that they had county authorization, that they had already invested heavily in construction and marketing. And then he said something I didn't forget. He said maybe I should consider a land swap, because this kind of exposure could benefit both sides. I actually laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so far removed from reality it felt like a different language. I told him I don't trade certified farmland, especially not for a destroyed tract that was built without verifying ownership. And I could hear the silence on the other end shift, like he wasn't used to being refused so directly. That's when the tone turned sharper, less polite, more defensive, and he started talking about how their contractor had done work all over Georgia, how mistakes like this basically never happen. And I remember thinking there it is, the first crack, not in the land, but in accountability. Mark filed the official agricultural encroachment claim through the Superior Court that same week, and once that happened, everything slowed down in a frustrating way, like justice had to go through traffic before it could arrive anywhere useful. In the meantime, Dylan's company didn't stop anything. They kept running the track, trucks still flying through mud pits sitting on top of my soil, spectators showing up on weekends like nothing was wrong. And that part honestly messed with me more than the damage itself, because it felt like watching someone throw a party inside your house while you're still calling the police. I drove out there one evening just to see it from a distance, didn't go near the entrance, just parked on a ridge and watched headlights move across land that used to grow something real. And I remember thinking how easily people can normalize what they benefit from, even if it sits on top of someone else's loss. Weeks passed like that, slow and heavy, until the court date finally came, and I didn't expect much going in. I've seen enough disputes in rural counties to know how messy facts become once lawyers start rearranging them. But Judge Harris, a quiet man with a reputation for being blunt, didn't seem interested in any of the noise. He looked at the survey maps, the county records, the overlay Mark provided. And then he just leaned back slightly and said the boundary is clearly established. There's no ambiguity here. And I remember Dylan shifting in his seat when he said it, because that's the moment the story stopped being flexible. The judge ruled that the mud track was entirely within my certified onion production land, and ordered them to restore it within 15 days or authorize me to carry out the restoration and bill them for it. And when I heard that, I didn't feel victory, not immediately. I just felt this strange quiet, like the land itself had finally been acknowledged in a room full of people who had been arguing about it. Dylan left the courtroom looking like he was already planning the next argument, not accepting the outcome. And I remember thinking this isn't over for him yet, even if it should be. And he was right, because what came next wasn't compliance, it was delay, and that delay pushed everything toward a decision point none of us could avoid. 15 days sounds like a generous amount of time when a judge says it in a quiet courtroom. But out there on the land it moves differently. It stretches, it drags, and in Dylan Mercer's case it barely moved at all, because nothing changed after that ruling. Not the track. Not the trucks. Not even the attitude. I kept waiting for some sign they were taking it seriously, heavy equipment arriving to start the fill, crews marking off sections, anything that looked like compliance. But instead I'd see headlights at night and tire marks fresh in the morning, like the place had decided the court order didn't apply to it. On the 13th day I drove out there again, this time closer, and I could hear the engines before I even reached the ridge, that deep mechanical roar bouncing off the clay pits they had dug into my land. And I remember sitting there with my hands on the steering wheel thinking there's a point where waiting stops being patience and becomes permission, and I wasn't willing to give them any more of either. The morning of day 16, I didn't call anyone first. I didn't argue. I didn't send another notice. I just opened the equipment yard and started my biggest bulldozer, the one we used for clearing drainage lines after heavy storms. And I remember the smell of diesel and dust hitting the air like something waking up that hadn't been needed in a long time. I brought in scrapers, graders, everything we had that could move earth with purpose instead of recreation, and when we rolled onto that property, it didn't feel like an invasion. It felt like correction. The track was still active when we arrived, which still feels surreal when I think about it now, like two realities occupying the same space, one pretending to be permanent and the other proving it wasn't. I climbed into the dozer and just started where the first mud pit opened up like a wound in the ground, pushing soil back into it slowly at first, watching water spill over the edges, then faster as the machine found its rhythm. And I remember thinking this is what reversal looks like, not dramatic, not cinematic, just heavy and steady and irreversible in the other direction. Dylan showed up maybe an hour in, his convoy of trucks kicking up dust as they pulled in, and I could see him before I could hear him because he was already shouting, waving his arms, looking like he couldn't process what he was seeing, like the existence of consequences had suddenly become personal. He stormed up to the edge of the work zone yelling about schedules, sponsors, permits, and I shut the dozer down for a second, just long enough to step out, the engine still ticking behind me, and I remember how loud everything sounded when it stopped, like the land itself exhaled. He said, "You can't just destroy a championship course. Do you know what this costs?" And I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, and all I could think was he still didn't see the farm. He still saw a project. I reached into the cab and pulled out the folded court order, the same one I had been carrying since the hearing, and handed it to him without raising my voice. "You had 15 days, I said. "This isn't destruction, this is enforcement." He skimmed it fast, then slower. And I could see the realization hit in pieces, not all at once, like each paragraph was another step closing a door he thought would stay open. His legal team arrived not long after, trying to argue emergency injunctions, damage claims, lost revenue projections. But by then the work was already halfway done, berms flattened, pits filled, lanes erased back into raw earth that looked more like a field than a stadium. What surprised me most wasn't the anger. It was how quickly the structure disappeared once it stopped being maintained, like it had never fully belonged there in the first place. When the final grader passed over the last section, leveling it back to farm grade, there was this strange silence, not peaceful exactly, but final, like something had completed a cycle it never should have entered. Dylan tried to sue afterward. Of course he did, claiming construction costs, business losses, even reputational damage, and I didn't even get dragged into most of it because the judge dismissed it almost immediately, pointing back to his own ruling and the failure to comply. And in the end, they were ordered to cover my legal fees plus damages totaling $73,200. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't go out and mark the moment. I just walked the field a few days later and saw a rose being replanted where mud had been, and that felt like the only real resolution that mattered. But even now, I still think about how easily it all started. One conversation, one assumption, one man who thought land was flexible if you were confident enough, and I wonder how often that happens in places where people don't push back. Maybe I was right to bulldoze it. Maybe I wasn't. Maybe the court was the real answer, or maybe it only worked because I was willing to act when the system moved too slow. I don't know where you land on it, and honestly that's the part one still sit with, because out here, boundaries aren't just lines on paper, they're decisions people are forced to defend. If you had been in my position, would you have waited longer, or done the same thing I did? I'd actually like to hear how you see it, because this is one of those situations where the line between justice and escalation depends entirely on who you ask.